John chapter 12, verses 1 through 8 today. Last few weeks, had something happen at our house, and I wanted to share this story with you here this morning. I have owned a vehicle for 26 years, the same car. This is my car. I just took the picture yesterday. It's on my driveway with an ugly Jeep in the background. I didn't mean for that to be back there. But that's the car I've owned since I was 15 years old. And I've had it all these years. I've tried to keep it really nice, tried to do all the maintenance on it, make sure that the body stays nice, the interior stays nice. I've babied it. I don't put a lot of miles on it. I keep it off the roads in the wintertime. As you know, it was born and raised in Colorado, and now it lives in Iowa. I don't know if you realize that, but we use salt on the roads here, and salt ain't good for cars. And so she tells me that, wintertime comes, she wants to be in the garage and stay covered up. So I've really been careful all these years to make sure it stays nice, to not do anything to it, to make sure I park way out so nobody hits the doors. I'm just very careful with everything with this car. So recently, my wife and I were doing some work at the house, and we needed to move stuff in and out of storage. And at our house in our garage, we've got storage up. There's these like shelves up that hang from the ceiling. Anybody else have storage like this? And so we were in the garage was shut, and I had a ladder, and the ladder was up over to get up to one of these areas, and I was very careful. I got the ladder set in carefully, the car was there, and we were doing some work and passing things back and forth, and I was taking things off very carefully, to not drop it, and handing it to my wife and just handing things back up to me. And suddenly we need to leave, like something happened. We got to go run an errand real quick, so we left, and I just didn't think about it. We left the ladder where it was, and the garage was shut. The van was out in the driveway, so we left and came back, and as we came into the driveway, we hit the garage door opener, right? And the ladder was up like this, and the garage door came up and hit the ladder, and it moved like that, and the ladder came down on top of the car. Bam! Right on the back quarter panel, and there it is. See that dent right there? And that's only one of them. There's another one that's up a little further, and it hit and then slid and scratched all the way down the back of the car. And so I just stood there and stared at it for a while. And as a pastor, I'm not allowed to cuss. But I thought about it. After 26 years of keeping that car nice. So there's the damage, and there I am looking at the damage. So very frustrating. To add insult to injury, my team, the Broncos, are doing terrible as well. So this has just been a bad month, right? So to get that fixed, it's going to cost between $2,000 to $2,400 to get that fixed, because it's one of these situations. If we fix this, we take this dent out. Well, you got to take this out. Well, if you take that out, then we got to go up over the car. If we go up over the car, we got to do the other quarter panel. If we do the other quarter panel, we might as well do the bumper. If we do the bumper, we might as well do. It's like, all right, whatever. Just repent. I've been hoping to not put any money into that until I can pass it down to my kids and let them sink all the money into the car someday, right? Just keep it nice, but it's not going to happen that way. I'm going to have to get half of that car repainted at a cost of $2,400. So the question is it worth it? Is it worth it? I see some of you going, and I see a lot of ladies going, like that is what's happening here this morning. Is it worth getting that fixed? It's just an old, ugly car, right? 1984, just an old, ugly Firebird. I've had it all these years. Why get it fixed? You know what? I'm going to get it fixed. You know why I'm going to get it fixed? Because I've had it for a long time. I have a long history with that car. Back when I was 12 years old, my dad says, hey, if things go well here in the next few years, if you honor the Lord, if you honor us as your parents, and we have a good relationship, that when you turn 16, we'll buy a car together. That was the deal that I had with my dad. And so from age 12 on, I'm putting ideas in teenagers' minds here. This is great. I see kids like, yeah, passing notes to their parents. So age 12 on, I started looking at the newspapers for cars. If you're a young person here, there used to be this thing called advertisements in this section called classifieds, in this paper called a newspaper that was printed. So I started looking at these ads and checking out cars, and finally when I was 15 years old, we came to a car lot, and we found that car. It had 15,000 miles on it, and it was just a good fit. It was a good price, and we got it. I learned to drive on that car. It's a 1984. It's got T-tops. It's a stick shift. It's a 305 V8. I don't know what my dad was thinking, giving me a car like that as a 16-year-old. I learned how to drive a stick shift on that car. I went to college in that car. I drove around with my friends in high school. I drove Josh Byers around in high school. We were friends in high school. We have lots of memories in that car. Brought it to college. I took my wife on our first date in that car, and I've had it all these years. My son Elijah, when he was born, he started to see the car, and when he was just a little guy, he started calling it Daddy's Lightning McQueen car. Dad's McQueen car. Hey, Dad, can we take a ride in the McQueen car? It's just really a special thing. A number of years ago, the car was stolen, and I got it back, and they recovered it over on the north side of Des Moines. It's this long history with that car. I tell you what, the value of that car dictates my affections towards that car. The value that I have, that I feel for that car, and many of you probably wouldn't have any value for that car, but the value that I have for that car dictates whether I spend the money to get it fixed. Because value, the way you value something, will always determine and dictate the affections that you have for said item. As we look at John chapter 12 this morning, this is a very important chapter in the flow of the book of John because it's a transitional chapter. And John has been giving us this case for who Jesus is. It culminates at the end in chapter 20. John chapter 20 verse 31 says, "But these things are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." And so chapters 1 through 11, John's been setting up this case. He starts and he talks about Jesus as the Word, this idea of the Word, and the Word becomes flesh and he dwells among us, and then the Word starts to do miracles and signs, and John's been building this case. He's been showing us, putting on display the glories of Jesus Christ. And so we come to chapter 12, and it's the end of the first section in the book of John. The rest of the book of John talks about his passion and going to the cross. But we come to the end of this section, and it's as if John has built this case. It's as if John has shown us this mountain, and this mountain's name is Jesus Christ, and he has us stand there, and he has us look at it, and he says to you, and he says to me, and he says to everybody who's ever read this book, what do you think of Jesus? What do you think of this Jesus guy? He's pretty amazing, isn't he? That's what John's saying. And that's what John is saying to this audience, and that's what John is recounting as he writes this book. He's recounting the story of Jesus coming and presenting himself. But not everybody who saw Jesus accepted Jesus. Not everybody who saw Jesus thought Jesus was so great. And so in John chapter 12, what we have are various responses to Jesus. In John chapter 12 flows along, and it seems like a random cluster of stories, but it's not a random cluster of stories. Everything that John does is very meticulously planned. And John shows us these stories of the different responses to Jesus as people have seen the evidence. And they have to decide, is Jesus our greatest treasure, or is Jesus dispensable? And some thought Jesus was worth it, and others thought Jesus was dispensable, worthy of being killed. The struggle for light and darkness in chapter 12 reaches a fever pitch. The light is shining brightly, and the enemies of the light are desperately working to extinguish the light. Chapter 12 makes us choose sides. What side are you going to be on? So we come to chapter 12, and it says, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. If you remember right, he had just spent some time in the Jerusalem area. In Bethany, he raised Lazarus from the dead. There were a lot of people that didn't like the fact that he raised Lazarus from the dead, and there was a decree that went out from the religious leaders to arrest Jesus and to kill them whenever they had the opportunity. And so Jesus departed to Ephraim just for a short period of time. And now he's back. And now he's back to Jerusalem. And the reason he's back to Jerusalem is so that he can be nailed to a cross. And it says, therefore Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus was, whom Jesus raised from the dead. Verse 2, so they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at the table. And so Jesus comes back for a dinner. When was this dinner? Well, think of it like this. Have you heard before of Palm Sunday? Raise your hand if you've heard of Palm Sunday. Anybody? We've all heard of Palm Sunday. You've been around church very long. I watched a video the other day of my son Elijah singing a Palm Sunday song that he learned here at church, and he had his little palm branch in his hand. And maybe if you went to Sunday school, you remember walking out with the palm branch, right? Palm Sunday, when Jesus enters Jerusalem, it's a Sunday, and that week, the things that happen, Thursday of that week is the Last Supper, Friday is when he's crucified, and the next Sunday is when he comes back out of the grave alive. That's the sequence of that week. Palm Sunday starts that. And so if you think of Palm Sunday and back up a couple of days to Friday night, that's when this dinner takes place. Jesus is in Bethany. He's at a home of a man named Simon, and they have a dinner. It's the Friday night before Palm Sunday. We hear this story from Matthew, Mark, and John. There's a similar story in Luke, but it's different. It's a different person. It's a different setting. And so if you want to read the other stories from the synoptics, Matthew and Mark, you find this story. And so Jesus comes to a dinner. The dinner was planned by Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. It was in honor of Jesus. Why do you think they planned a special dinner in honor of Jesus? Well, he had just raised Lazarus from the dead. It was a dinner honoring Jesus because he'd raised Lazarus from the dead, and so he comes back and they have this dinner the Friday night before Palm Sunday. They loved Jesus. They valued Jesus. They had affection for Jesus. They served Jesus. They gave generously to Jesus. Why? Because they valued him. Why did they value Jesus? Because they had a long history with Jesus. They knew him. They'd spent time with him. They valued him. And so they showed him great affection. The question that I want to ask this morning, and as we go through the sermon, we'll ask this question numerous times: how do your affections match his incalculable value? How do your affections for Jesus match his incalculable value? You cannot put a price on Jesus. You cannot set a value for Jesus. It is incalculable. So how do your affections for Jesus match that? Because they will match. Your affections for Jesus will match how much you value him. Just like it is with anything in your life. What you value, you will show affection for. And so let's look at this text. There's a contrast in this text. There's a high valuation of Jesus and a low valuation of Jesus. There's a high valuation that relates to and corresponds to high affection, and there's a low valuation of Jesus that corresponds to low valuation of Jesus. So let's look at the first idea here this morning. First, high value of Jesus equals high affection. And those who had high value for Jesus was Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And it says, so they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at the table. Let's look first at Martha's extravagant service. Martha was serving. This is something that Martha liked to do. In Luke chapter 10, we read a story about Mary and Martha serving Jesus, and Martha was busy in the kitchen, and she was doing all of the work, and Mary was sitting at Jesus' feet, listening to him teach. And do you remember what happened? If you've heard the story before? Martha comes to Jesus and says, hey, Jesus, tell my bum sister to help me out in the kitchen. I mean, what's she doing here, right? I'm doing all the work in the kitchen. She's just sitting here listening to you talk. And what does Jesus say? No, Mary is doing a good work too by sitting and savoring who I am and listening to me teach. And Jesus rebukes Martha for that. But we learned something about Martha in Luke 10, and we learned something about Martha here, that her love language was serving. This is how she showed affection for Jesus, was by serving him, and she was working on this meal. She had been working on this meal, and making a meal in that day was not an easy task. They did not have modern kitchens and modern conveniences. She was probably working for days on this meal. The aroma of the food filled the home that day, and Martha busied herself with her best recipes, loving to serve Jesus course after course after course of food. And so I just ask again, how do your affections for Jesus match his incalculable value? There are different ways of showing it. Sometimes we show it through serving. Sometimes we show it through giving. There are different ways that we can show our affection for Jesus. Sometimes we can get a little self-righteous, however, in the way that we show our affection for Jesus. Like Martha did when she went and told Jesus that Mary wasn't helping her in the kitchen. Sometimes that happens. We like to serve Jesus a certain way, and we look down on others because they don't like to serve Jesus in the same way. A friend of mine years ago was very excited about sharing Christ. He loved to share Christ with people, and he loved to share Christ with people that were just strangers. He was very good at it, and I remember it got to a point where he was a little judgmental of people that didn't go share Jesus with perfect strangers. And he was talking about someone in particular. He says, yeah, what about that guy? He never goes out and shares Jesus with anybody. I said to him, did you know that that guy has an amazing ministry with widows and elderly people? It helps to care for their finances. It helps to care for their physical needs. Did you know? Did you do any of that? Do you do any of that kind of stuff? Well, no. It kind of silenced him. Suddenly he realized that he was doing what he was good at, and someone else was doing what they were good at. We all have different gifts. We all have different skills. We all have different ways that we would naturally find to serve Jesus. For some, that love and affection is shown through serving, making a meal, things like that. For others, it is in different ways. And you see, Martha wasn't trying to serve Jesus to gain points with Jesus. Martha was serving Jesus because she loved and valued Jesus. And the same is true for us. We don't serve God because we're trying to gain points with God. We serve Him because He is totally worth it. Because we love Him. Because He died for us. Because He's our Savior. Because He's our treasure. And the value that we have for Jesus relates to our affections for Him. And then we see Mary's extravagant generosity. I wanted to pause and talk about Martha for a minute because I think Martha gets overlooked in this text and all the attention's on Mary. We need to remember that Martha was there making the meal. She was busy. She was serving Jesus in her own way. And Mary was also serving Jesus. Verse 3, it says, Mary therefore took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped His feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of her perfume. Mary served Jesus in her own way. There's an interesting word here in verse 3. It says, Mary therefore took a pound. The word therefore connects this verse to what came prior in verse 2. In verse 2 it says, so they, meaning Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, as a group, as a family, they gave a dinner for Jesus. They had planned this dinner. In verse 3 says, therefore, Mary took this gift and anointed Jesus with this expensive ointment. I get the idea here that this was planned. I get the idea, because of the word therefore and how it connects verses 2 and 3 together, that Mary had planned to do this. In fact, that Martha and Lazarus also were part of this plan, that this ointment was something they had as a family, that it was maybe a family heirloom, or somehow they had come across it, or they were a family of means. We don't know about that for sure, but somehow it seems that they had planned this out, and that anointing the feet of Jesus was going to be part of this dinner that night. So what is this perfume? Well, this was a special perfume, an ointment that was made from an aromatic root of a stem of an herb that grew in northern India. It was very expensive. And it says here in the text, a pound. It was probably actually more like 12 ounces. If you could think of it like a can of Coke is how much it was. A can of pop. And Mary takes this ointment and she anoints Jesus with this very expensive ointment that was often saved for special occasions, and many times it was saved for embalming a body after death. If you can imagine the scene with me, she stands behind Jesus at His feet. And the reason she's at His feet is because the tables were low, and in that day, when you ate down in a reclined position. And so it was a low table, and everybody was around the table, and you sat down like this on your left side on a cushion, and your legs were out like this, and everybody was towards the table, and you ate with your right hand. Did you like that? I don't do that normally, but I'm in jeans today, so it felt good to just get down on the floor like that, right? down on the floor, sit on the cushion, feet out. The reason why the feet were out is because you got the feet as far away from the food as possible. Why did you do that? Because all they had to wear in those days were chacos, right? Birkenstocks, the Jesus sandals. Roads were dirty, strewn with litter and trash, dirt, dust, and mud, and probably most offensively, manure. When you came to somebody's house or when somebody came to your house, before they entered, you would wash their feet. In our culture today, we slip our shoes off and put them on boot trays or on pieces of a carpet, right? In those days, take the shoes off and make sure that you made arrangements to have your guests' feet washed. But even after washing the feet, you still got the feet as far away from the food as possible, and so everybody sat and their feet were out. And Mary comes to Jesus, coddling this special treasure in her hand, and the container breaks, and she spills it on the feet of Jesus. And we learn from Matthew and Mark that she didn't just stew his feet, she also anointed his head. And so this fragrant perfume is dripping down through the hair of Jesus and onto his dirty, stained clothing and onto his feet. She anoints his feet and his head, and soon his entire body is aromatic with this ointment in this perfume. To make this statement even louder, she gets down on her hands and knees and unbinds her hair. And instead of using a towel to wipe his feet, she uses her hair to wipe the ointment from Jesus' feet. Now, in that culture, this was probably somewhat appalling because Jewish women never let down their hair in public. In fact, letting down your hair was reserved for your husband's eyes only. It would have been considered immodest, on a par with baring your breasts in public to a group of people. But at this point, Mary doesn't care. She lets her hair down, her glory, the cleanest thing that she has, and she uses it to wipe the dirty, muddy, dung-caked feet of our Savior. What an amazing show of affection for Jesus. And I love the way verse 3 reads. Look with me at the end of verse 3. She wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. You know, it was only a week later that Jesus was crucified. In their homes, they didn't necessarily have closets with lots of changes of clothes. You pretty much wore the same clothes all the time. Ointment like this was very expensive, and she used a lot of it, and it got all over Jesus' clothes. It's not a stretch to think that as Jesus was going through his crucifixion, that the smell of this perfume was still on his body and on his clothing as he went to the cross. And it says in this text that the whole entire house was filled with the fragrance. It's as if you could translate it like this: the beauty and the sincerity of Mary's worship was a sweet aroma in the home. Mark chapter 14 verse 9 says it like this, and Jesus is saying this about Mary: truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what Mary has done for me will be told in memory of her. And here we are today, 2,000 years later, still talking about Mary's extravagant gift for Jesus. You know, whereas some people's love language and worship language is serving, for other people it's giving. And over the years of my ministry, I've been privileged to know some extremely generous people. People who've used their resources to push forward God's Great Commission. And let me tell you this, the Great Commission and moving forward the Great Commission costs money. And I'm so thankful for generous people who have given over the years to make that possible, who've given to make this church possible, and the things that we're doing here in this church possible. I remember when I first moved to Waterloo, I was a young guy, I wasn't married yet, and the church didn't have a lot of money. They were going through a difficult time financially, but they wanted to bring me on, but they couldn't pay me very much. That was kind of the deal. You want to come serve here? We can't pay you that much. And I'm like, oh, that's really a surprise. I've never heard that from churches before. No. But we can give you a place to live. Oh, that's good. It's like a parsonage, the old-time parsonage. Well, how's that going to work? Well, there happens to be a guy here in the church that purchased a condominium. And he owns a condominium, and he purchased this condominium for the specific use of having missionaries stay in this condominium. He's purchased it, he's furnished it, and it's for God's use. However God wants him to use it, he'll use it. And I'm so thankful for that. The guy that purchased a house so that God's servants could live there. It enabled me to start my ministry at that church. I'm so thankful for God's people who are generous and generously support the ministry. And so I'd ask you the question again, what is Jesus worth to you? How do your affections for Jesus match how you value him? Because those two things will match. Because what we value, we show affection for. And so as you're thinking in your mind, how do your affections match the way that you value Jesus? Is Jesus worth it to you? Is Jesus worth giving 10% of our income? Absolutely. Absolutely. Jesus is worth serving. Jesus is worth giving for. Jesus is worth sacrificing for. He is worthy. Not everybody thinks of it that way, however, and in the text we have someone who had a low value of Jesus. And a low value of Jesus equals low affection for Jesus. And his name was Judas. So let's see what Judas actually valued here in the text. It says, verse 4, but Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, and I love John's editorial comment, he who was about to betray him. Now, I like that phrase in there because what it tells us is that this instance right here, what happened right here, this may have been somewhat of a tipping point. Judas maybe was wrestling with what to do, but right here, he kind of decided this was the last straw. He wasn't getting out of Jesus what he wanted to get out of Jesus, and so he's like, fine, I'm going to go get it some other way. He sees this expensive oil being broken and used on Jesus' feet. And he says, can you imagine saying this out loud in front of Jesus, in front of Mary, and in front of all the other disciples? I have to think that that Judas was hoping for an amen or an attaboy or something maybe from some of the other disciples. He didn't get that at all. But look what he says here. Verse 4, Judas Iscariot, one of the disciples, he who was about to betray him, said, why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? Now, how much is 300 denarii? Well, one denarius, is the wage for a day's work in the Bible days for an average laborer. So let's translate that into today's realm. 300, that would be a year's worth of work for an average laborer. We would say that this can of pop sized flask of ointment was probably worth in today's dollars $25,000. Can you imagine that? Hold a can of pop in your hand. $25,000. Can you imagine using that ointment the way that Mary did? Think of that. Giving a gift of $25,000 to anoint Jesus, to anoint his head, his shoulders, his feet. One use. Break the ointment, it's gone. $25,000, gone. It's over, done. 25 grand. Judas looks at it and says, what a waste. Now in our minds too, you think of that, right? $25,000 to anoint the feet of Jesus. Man, couldn't there have been a better use for that? I mean, aren't there homeless shelters we could have given that to? Just think of all the people we could have fed. Man, you could have built 6 churches in Africa for the cost of that ointment. And it's easy to start to think the way Judas thinks, isn't it? And the reason it's easy to think the way Judas thinks is because he didn't value Jesus, and sometimes I don't know if we value Jesus the way that we should either. And what does Jesus say in response? Well, Jesus says, leave her alone. But it's not before. John gives us an editorial comment in verse 6, and he says he said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. Having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself. So Judas watches this ointment being poured out on Jesus' feet, $25,000 worth, and in his mind he's thinking, cha-ching, the dollar signs are going in his eyes. He's thinking if he had all that money in his money bag, how much he could skim off the top. You see, he really didn't care about the poor. He cared about himself. He was wanting to get something out of Jesus. He wanted to get money out of Jesus. He wanted to get fame out of Jesus. He wanted to get position out of Jesus, and it wasn't happening. And at the end of the day, he ended up despising Jesus, and if he couldn't get money that way, then he'd sell him for 30 pieces of silver. And that's what happened, exactly what happened a few days later. And so we have Jesus rebuke after this in verse 7 and 8. It says, Jesus says, leave her alone so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. The poor you will always have with you, but you do not always have me. That's a really hard saying. You're always going to have poor people around you. Just get used to it. Poor people exist, but you don't always have me. Leave her alone. She was saving this for my burial. Now, there's some dispute, some debate on how much Mary knew. I happen to side on the fact that Mary probably knew that Jesus was going to die. Jesus often said this to his disciples. He said it very clearly to his disciples that he's going to go to Jerusalem and that he's going to be killed, but 3 days later he's going to raise from the dead. And I think Mary knew this because Mary sat at Jesus' feet. She listened to him teach many, many occasions. I think she knew it. I think Mary was saving this for his burial. But I think Mary decided instead of saving it for his burial that she would give him this gift while he was still alive. I think this was a special gift from Mary to Jesus. And Jesus says, leave her alone. She's doing a special work for me. And so as we wrap this up this morning, I just want to think through again with you in your life today, how do your affections for Jesus match his incalculable value? How does your service for Jesus match his incalculable value? Let me give you 3 thoughts as we close up this sermon this morning. Number 1, Jesus is worthy of extravagant sacrifice. He is worthy of extravagant sacrifice. In the boldest terms possible, we'd say it like this: is it possible to cherish and honor Jesus today in a way that would seem extravagant? If you think of an impoverished church in some area of the world like Africa or South America, somewhere that would be considered a developing world, is it okay for them to bind together to give their money to build a church for worship that according to their standards would seem extravagant? Is that okay, or is that a waste of the ointment? Is it okay for us in our culture to build a beautiful church, to invest in something that's aesthetically pleasing in a sanctuary for us to worship and to sing and to be together as a church family? Or is that a waste of the ointment? At the simplest level, this tension surfaces as you could think of a church meeting together, a church board deciding what they want to do, a church business meeting that maybe some of you have been part of before in your past in different churches where people are talking about how to use money, and there's a desperate need in a church to remodel the auditorium because it's old and it's outdated, and they decide to spend the money to remodel the auditorium, and someone raises their hand and says, well, that's a shame. Jesus would have given that money to the poor instead of spending it on lights and new carpet for this auditorium. There it is. The attitude of Judas. And you see, many times it's really not a care for the poor, it's just a care for what you want to see, what your pet project is all about. I remember I moved into that condominium up in Waterloo, and there were some people in the church that had donated furniture to the condo because they knew this man was buying this condo for missionaries. And there was some talk. I never met these people, never talked to them. I didn't know who they were, but there was some talk going on in the church that, hey, we donated that furniture, and it was supposed to be used for missionaries, not for pastors. I remember thinking, that's ridiculous, right? If I did meet those people, I would have called them Judas. No, I'm kidding. I wouldn't have done that. Right? I would have read John chapter 12 to them. Right? What a silly, silly attitude. I remember back when we were adding on to this facility and we were talking about the cost analysis of it and how much it was going to cost to do this. And an older and wiser saint in our church looked at me and he says, look, stop thinking about the cost. He said to me, it is hard to put a dollar value on this space being used to teach kids about Jesus. And to that I say, amen. Right? It's hard to put a dollar value to those things. Judas had a problem. He had his own ideas of what Jesus was supposed to do and what Jesus was supposed to be. He wanted to use Jesus for his own gain, for his own benefit. And so I ask again, is Jesus worthy of extravagant sacrifice? And the answer is a resounding yes. What is your most treasured possession? Are you willing to give up your most treasured possession to Jesus? Jesus, if you want my Firebird, it's yours. Although I don't know if you know how to drive a stick shift, so it may not be any use to you, right? What is your most treasured possession? Are you willing to give that up for Jesus? Or do you seek to hoard the blessings of your life, to hoard the things that you've been given for your own use? I want you to look at number 2 here this morning. His value grows as we sit at his feet. There's an interesting end to this text in verses 7 and 8. Jesus says, leave her alone so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. The poor you will always have with you, but you do not always have me. In other words, you always have the poor. You don't always have me. So savor me while I'm here. And what Jesus is saying is it is important for us, it's important to put a priority on our lives of savoring Jesus. And one of the things we know about Mary, Martha, and Lazarus is that they savored Jesus. They listened to Jesus. They spent time listening to him teach, and Mary sat at his feet and took in all the teaching and how we need that in our lives, how we need to sit at our Savior's feet, how we need to know him more, to value him more. And you see, if you're going to have good affections for Jesus, and if those affections are going to be sacrificial affections, you have to value him, and there's no other way to value Jesus than to spend time with Jesus. The reason that Mary, Martha, and Lazarus sacrificed so greatly is because they valued Jesus. The reason they valued Jesus is because they had spent time with Jesus. And that brings me to the third idea this morning. A low valuation of Jesus can be dangerously depressing. If you are a Christian and you have a low valuation of Jesus, that can be dangerously depressing. And it was for Judas. As he had a low valuation of Jesus, and he was not getting out of Jesus what he wanted. You see, Judas was hoping to ride into Jerusalem with Jesus on a horse, triumphing over the Romans, hoping that he would be some kind of high up ruler in Jesus' kingdom. That's what he had in mind, and suddenly he's realizing that's not going to come true. And so he discards Jesus. Let me just warn you, Jesus will be very disappointing to you. He'll be very disappointing to you if you want him for the wrong reasons. If you're following Jesus for the wrong reasons, he will be an epic disappointment for you. You see, Jesus did not come, God did not send Jesus to die on the cross for your sins, to give you a happy and comfortable life. He saved you to be holy and to be more like Jesus. That's why we need him, to be conformed to his image. People like Judas that have a low valuation of Jesus are people who end up leaving the church disenfranchised with who he is. These are the people who are easily offended at little things, or they refuse to forgive little things or even big things, and they drop off the radar. These are the people who are constantly critical and complaining about things in the church. These are the people who feel that they've held up their end of the bargain, but God's not held up his end of the bargain. And they walk away and say, forget it. If this is what being a Christian is all about, I've lived my life the way I'm supposed to, and I still have bad things happening to me. See, that's indicative of a low valuation of Jesus. And so I'd ask again, how do your affections for Jesus match his incalculable value? Friend, wherever you are today, you can take a step forward in how you value Jesus. Wherever you are today, there is a step forward for you in your life. If you're sitting here this morning, I'm glad that you're here. If you're here today, maybe you've come to this church for many years, maybe you're here for the first time, maybe you're new to Christianity. I don't know all of your stories here this morning, but if you're here today, 2 thumbs up. I'm glad you're here. Thank you for coming. This is where you need to be. But let me just say it like this. Jesus is worth far more than just 1 hour a week on Sundays. He is worth far more than that. And wherever you are today in your Christian walk, there is a step forward. There's a next step for you. How can you get to know Jesus more? My point today is not to guilt you into sacrificing for Jesus. My point today is to drive you to the feet of Jesus so you know him more, so you value him more. And by valuing him more, you naturally want to sacrifice and live for him. What's your next step today? Is Jesus worth getting to know? Yes. Is Jesus worth sacrificing for? Yes. Is Jesus worth going across the world to serve him? Yes. Is Jesus worth giving our money for? Yes. Is Jesus worth opening our homes to a program called Safe Families? Yes. By the way, we had a meeting here last Wednesday with Safe Families. It was a great meeting. I know many of you were hoping to be able to make it and didn't make it, couldn't make it for some reason or another. But if you are interested in learning more about Safe Families, it's a great program of connecting people in churches to people in need, people that maybe have a need, single moms that may be on the verge of having DHS come into their lives. If you're interested in that, just put that on your Connect card. And this is the point that I have you take your Connect cards out. And so if you would just reach out in front of you, grab a Connect card this morning, and hopefully you started filling that out already. If you're a guest with us, we'd like to get some information from you. If you're a regular attender, just put your name. On the back of that, you'll find a place for comments, questions, and next steps. What's your next step today? Maybe you missed the meeting with Safe Families. If you would like more information, write on your Connect card, Safe Families. I'll add you to the email list. I'd love to add you to that. If you're an empty nester here today, you couldn't be in a more perfect spot to do Safe Families. Really, anybody is in a perfect spot for that, but especially if you're someone who's an empty nester here this morning, you're in a great spot for something like that. Is Jesus worth standing at our front door and greeting people as they come in for the services? The answer is yes. Is Jesus worth serving on the safety team? Yes. Is Jesus worth serving in a classroom with little kids in this church? The answer is yes. What is your next step? How can you show greater affection for Jesus by serving him in some way? That's your next step today. Would you write that? Think about it in your mind and your heart today. How can you make a good next step today in wanting to serve Jesus? Maybe for you, your next step is to be baptized. You've watched people baptized here this morning, and you're like, you know what, that's for me. I need to be baptized as well. I've never been baptized as a believer, and I want to be. Or maybe today you've just come to know Jesus for the first time. Would you just write that on your Connect card? What's your next step today in your life to show just how worthy Jesus is